Imagine the year is 2028. Xi Jinping, the leader of China, has decided to try to change the status quo on Taiwan for whatever reason. Long-held plans, internal pressures, or some provocative act by the Taiwanese. There's economic measures that he could take, or military ones. The first thing that comes to mind is obviously invasion, but this is a very dangerous course of action with many pitfalls. He could try to seize some of the outlying islands on Taiwan. But in the middle is a blockade, an attempt by Chinese forces to physically interdict merchant ships going to Taiwan and apply coercion that way. The first vessels of the Chinese Coast Guard and the People's Armed Forces Maritime Militia go out and start boarding and seizing vessels bound for Taiwan. What would happen? How could the Taiwanese react? And would the United States intervene? And how, if so, what would that look like?
To answer these questions, CSIS ran 26 iterations of a war game looking at what would happen if China instituted a blockade of Taiwan, looked at many different scenarios. The purpose was to inform both decision makers and the wider community about what the options were and what the consequences might be. The work was funded by the Smith Richardson Foundation and the Diane Davis Spencer Foundation.
As a blockade could take many different forms, we looked at it from two primary variables in order to shape our thinking. First is China's escalation level, where at a very basic level, they could just try to board ships bound to Taiwan using the Chinese Coast Guard and the People's Armed Forces Maritime Militia. But the conflict could range all the way up to a wider war, where China is attacking any ships that go not just to Taiwan, but also U.S. ships in the region and Japan. Conversely, there's many different ways that the coalition could respond. First, the United States might not even be involved. If Taiwan's by itself, they could act in a circumspect manner and constrain their military forces to the area around Taiwan. Or they could be more assertive and try to stop Chinese military forces and non-military forces that are conducting the blockade. When the United States gets involved, it could be involved in a more limited way, just trying to escort convoys to Taiwan. Or, again, there could be a wider war where the United States is striking Chinese forces outside of the declared exclusion zone and even on the Chinese mainland. Combining these two variables together, we have a matrix of different scenarios that could constitute a blockade. In the upper left, you can see that we have a Chinese boarding effort that's met by a constrained Taiwan. In the lower right, there's a wider war by China where they're attacking U.S. bases in Japan, and that's met by a wider war by the United States where they're even attacking the Chinese mainland. We also want to look at how these scenarios would change if certain variables change and conduct sensitivity analysis in this way. Therefore, along the diagonals, we have multiple different iterations looking at different changes to our variables to see how the outcome would change. The result is 19 iterations in these different scenarios where the escalation levels are fixed to look at what would happen if both sides were locked into a certain scenario.
To examine the dynamics of escalation, the project ran 5 free-play games. In those games, the two sides were not given an escalation level to begin at, but could choose their own escalation level. In some games, the teams went to a high level of violence. In other games, they found an off-ramp to limit the level of escalation and violence.
Whatever the format of the games, we use 3 basic modules in order to model the combat and the economic effects on Taiwan. The first answers the question of what shipping is available to try to go to Taiwan. Second, we move into what of that shipping that's sent to Taiwan makes it there, given both the Chinese efforts to stop it and the U.S. and Taiwanese efforts to push it through. Finally, we look at what the effects of that cargo arriving on Taiwan are, particularly looking at energy production. We would run those models for 1 week, get the results, brief them back to players, and the players would make decisions again for the next week and continue through that cycle 20 times to get a look at 20 weeks of gameplay.
The project began by establishing a zero baseline. What would happen to Taiwan's economy and society if nothing got through the Chinese blockade. Here you see three futures. The middle one is what would happen if the blockade occurred with Taiwan's day-to-day posture. The upper one is what would happen if Taiwan increased inventories and made certain preparations for its economy and society. The lower one here is what would happen if Taiwan increased its efforts towards green energy. The problem here you can see is that because that relies so heavily on natural gas and moves away from nuclear and coal, it's not very resilient, and by week 8 is down to 20%, whereas the prepared level is at 80%. This gives a sense about what would happen to Taiwan's economy and society in a zero baseline. Week 9, when coal inventories are exhausted, electricity production goes down to 20%, which is only enough for emergency services. In week 26, food is not a problem, but electricity production is down to 16% as oil inventories become exhausted.
We'll now walk viewers through an example of one of these iterations and what the results look like. So this is a 3x3 scenario where China is using offshore attacks to try to stop ships from getting to Taiwan, and the US and Taiwan are escorting convoys to try to push supplies through. Thus, in this way, both sides are sort of fighting with one arm tied behind their backs. If we look at the board, commercial shipping from around the world is going to Japan, but continues no further as it knows that there's high risk of it if it tries to go to Taiwan. Those goods, therefore, are transshipped onto ships that are owned by the United States and Taiwan. They go through the Nansei Shodo, this chain of Japanese islands, where they're afforded the political protection of being in Japanese territorial waters. Then they finally try to make the crossing from Yonaguni-jima at the end of that to Taiwanese water, carrying cargo, oil, and liquid natural gas in order to keep electricity production and the economy of Taiwan going. We see here now the results of running this for 20 weeks. At the top, electricity production at some point goes to 35% of Taiwan's peacetime levels. At the same week, no cargo is brought in. However, by the end of the 20 weeks, Taiwan and the United States are able to restore electricity production and cargo flows to Taiwan. However, this comes at great cost. Taiwan and the United States both lose over 100 merchant ships that are lost in the effort, and this is a steep cost to pay in such a scenario. However, it's necessary in order to keep the Taiwanese economy functioning. Both sides also lose hundreds of aircraft and dozens of warships. Now, these losses are also occurring on the Chinese side, who are losing comparable amounts of men and material. Overall, both sides have thousands of casualties spread out amongst them.
This shows the effect on Taiwan's economy and society. You can see the dark blue line here. This is electricity production, dips early on as convoys are intercepted, but builds up to 100% later on as the convoys are able to get through. The same thing with the import levels. They dip more deeply because they don't have as much inventory, but again, they build up to 100%. Here you can see the ship arrivals down here at the bottom. There's a dip here, which you can see here. That's the result of no convoy sailing in that week.
Overall, we can look at the electricity production on Taiwan and the casualties that occur. As might be expected, casualties increase as both sides escalate more and more. Particularly important to note is that if China decides to go to the maximum escalation and starts bombarding the electrical grid of Taiwan itself, then Taiwan will have a very hard time keeping electricity production up. In a similar way that Russia has attacked that of Ukraine, China could do that to Taiwan, except that Taiwan does not have the strategic depth of Ukraine and the land borders to Romania and Poland to bring supplies through.
The project came to 5 overall observations. The first is that blockades almost always have casualties. They are not bloodless military operations. The second is that there are escalatory pressures at every level, sometimes on one side, sometimes on the other. Taiwan cannot face China alone. The disparity in economic and military power is too great. It needs U.S. help if it is to remain an autonomous and democratic entity. Energy and merchant ships are the critical factors for resilience because Taiwan does not produce very much energy on its own. It's reliant on imported energy. And finally, blockade is not a low-cost, low-risk operation for China. There's the possibility of escalation and also alienating the global community.
As a result of these observations across the 26 war games, we have a number of recommendations that we've binned into generally 4 categories. The first of which is that Taiwan and the United States need to prepare their merchant fleets. In order to deter China, China needs to believe that it cannot succeed in this endeavor. And one of those is by preparing the ships that will be needed to take cargo to Taiwan. Particularly important is the liquid natural gas carriers. These are specialized types of ships that keep liquid natural gas cool and densely packed, and that Taiwan is reliant on them in order to keep its electricity functioning.
Because energy is the weakest element in Taiwan's resilience, Taiwan needs to pay a special attention to that. One way to do it is to ensure that its energy sources are resilient. It can do that by extending the life on its existing nuclear power plant and also by hardening its electrical system. Allies and partners are critical to a U.S. military effort. Therefore, it needs to make joint plans with those allies and partners, particularly with Japan. Japan is critical both because of its potential as a transshipment point and also because of the U.S. military bases that are on Japan.
Finally, the United States and its allies and partners need to prepare to counter and end the blockade. Most important among those steps is thinking about off-ramps to offer Beijing. Beijing can't feel like it's painted into a corner and that the only way out is continued escalation. Somehow this conflict needs to end, but without Taiwan making substantive concessions to China.
For more information, see the full report at csis.org.